Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all of you. My classmate Angel Carrasco and yours truly, Darian Arango, are going to present the topic of apartheid and colonialism. So, the next slide, please. Yes, in this sense, this is our index, and the main topics are the present in the slide. So the next, please. Okay, so first, what is apartheid? It was a system of legislation, that upheld segregationist policies against non-white citizens of South Africa. Under apartheid, non-white South Africans, the majority of the population, will be forced to live in separate areas from whites and use separate public facilities. And despite a strong and constant opposition, the apartheid inside and outside South Africa, its laws remain in force for the better part of 90 years. And I think the next slide, please. Okay, so that is why the population was divided into main four groups, And the first, the whites who were descendants of British European settlers and Boers. Also, the Bantu or Africans, those who belong to any African ethnic group, generally grouped as blacks, and also the Asians, who were mostly Pakistanis or Indians who had migrated to South Africa since its incorporation into the Commonwealth. And finally, the so-called colored people, who were a group made up of people of other ancestry and mestizos, although this was also a common thread to encompass the three non-white groups. And the next slide, please.
Okay then. So now, um, once the definition of apartheid has been established, it is important to know the process chronologically in order to have a broad overview. So the objective of this approach is to provide the most important points and events that marked not only the South Africa population, but also create the optimal scenario for the application of this rational division. As we know, one of the most important events was the formation of the Union of South Africa, which is the predecessor of the Republic of South Africa. This point is very important because once the Second War with the Boers was over, the Crown recognized their sovereignty, and in turn, the Boers population undertook the rebuild the country. So we can see and consider that the population that took control of the reconstruction of the colonies were the white one. By 1948, the National Party took political control, which since its creation has pro-imperial policies and objectives. So one of the main actions that this regime was the establishment of English as the official language. At this point, several personalities who took the role of the Minister of the Union were establishing various policies in favor of apartheid. Among the different personalities, we can consider Johannes Gern Strange, a boy from the Transvaal colony who was a faithful believer of Afrikaner nationalism. Another one is Daniel Francois Malon, who was the greatest exponent of such nationalism. But the architect of apartheid is Hendrik French Borover, who would establish several laws in favor of the white population and constantly segregation the original population, such as the Bantu. Some of the law are the Popular Registration Act, Group Areas Act, the Bantu Education, and these will be explained later in the presentation. So now, it is important to consider that various policies and actions taken by the government of the Union generate discontent among the black population, which led to social mobilization where in 1960 this reached a point of no return with the Shopperville massacre, where the army, under the command of Daniel Francois Malon, opened fire on a peaceful protest. Also, an event here to highlight in the apartheid process was the independence of the South Africa in 1961, which in theory would open a new panorama for the country. However, the regime of racial segregation continued for a few more decades. At the same time, another event to consider was when Nelson Mandela was captured as a political prisoner, since he was an activist within his country for the end of this regime. So before his capture, he was a representative image of the struggle against apartheid. So last thing about this is by the 1969, the South Africa Student Organization were established, which undertook to generate consciousness in the black population. However, the laws against the black population continues establishing Afrikaans as a mandatory language in school, which generate riots in different areas as in Soweto in 1966. By 1985, the United Nations calls on its members to establish economic sanctions against the countries following the assassination of Stephen Biko, who was the leader of the South Africa Student Organizations, which leads to an embargo of the sales of weapons. And finally, at the same time, Frederick de Klerk took over the presidency of the country, freeing Nelson Mandela and becoming an actor in the fight against apartheid, which led to a dialogue between the Klerk government and the National Party. But before coming to the end of this process, it is necessary to point out other aspects of apartheid. So in these slides, we can see the personalities in favor of apartheid. Most of them are, well, all of them are boers, and the personalities against apartheid. There are Steve Biko, the leader of the student organization, Frederick de Klerk, and also Nelson Mandela. That is one of the most important personalities in this sense.
Okay, so now in the sense, the main consequences were first, a highly unequal society was generated in which whites had all the privilege and people of color, especially blacks, were relegated. Schools, hospitals, and services in general for the black population were precarious and of inferior quality. They were also fewer in number and less well equipped, resulting in overcrowding and then, secondly, the difficulties in accessing education meant that the number of black professionals was decreasing. As a consequence, the black population lacked healthcare, teachers, and lawyers, etc. Thirdly, the creation of Bantustans. Bantustans were one of the greatest examples of racial segregation imposed in South Africa by the apartheid system. So the creation of Bantustans caused the displacement of millions of people to recently in government approved locations, and this broke family ties, impoverished the quality of life of colored groups, and limited access to basic services such as water and electricity. And then the fourth, it is the relegation by the international community led to the gradual isolation of South Africa, which was expelled from the Commonwealth in 19 61, and some countries, such as Canada, banned their companies from doing business in South Africa. This was the cause of prolonged economic crisis. So in 1970s, the International Olympic Committee banned South Africa from participating in the Olympics. And finally, thousands of people were imprisoned, tortured, and even killed for demanding respect for their rights. And on the other hand, we must understand where apartheid comes from and how it is related to colonialism. So, the reality about the current system is that it was born of the past, and it is the product of the past, therefore, its implementation is directly proportional in relation to the past. In the other words, it is not an independent system, but depends to a large extent on the past political system. So, the political system the system of colonialism and apartheid succeeded in creating and building a sophisticated economic system to conquer the black majority and serve the interests of the white settled community. And the central tenet of colonialism and apartheid was to create an economic system and model that condemned the majority of the African population, as in this case today, to a lower standard of living compared to that of the white population. So the African population during apartheid seemed to live in the wilderness because the oppressive legislation that was created meant that restrictions were imposed on them. The next, please.
Okay, now, for practical purpose, it is extremely necessary to consider one of the areas most affected by this process, which was the Union of South Africa, made up of various colonies such as the Cape, Transvaal, Orange River, among others. However, the fundamental problem, and that gave way to a strong process of racial division, was the institutionalization of this division. It is clear that the legal weight that had these policies, acts, regulation within the Union were extremely strong and mandatory, which further reinforced the division within the colonies and eventually impact on the creation of the Republic of South Africa. So we must ask of ourselves, is South Africa really exempt from the profound effects of colonization and apartheid? So in these slides we can see the starting points that is the architect of the apartheid was Hendrik Franz Water, and another thing is that this process was institutional and have a legal support. Next. So, in that sense, and on the other hand, we must consider the various forms of racial segregation that were established in practice, also in law. It can be observed that segregation was not only in fields such as government position in companies, also various political and economic rights were restricted, such as the right to vote, to create business, to provide and obtain a job. Although interracial marriage was also provided, which generate many disagreements. This will eventually generate for Black people. So we must understand that the impacts within the population were not only at the governmental level, but also had an impact on subjectivities. It is also clear that the access to certain structure were limited for Black people, so that many actions became as privilege for the white population. Thus, these types of segregation were articulated in everyday life of the population. But eventually, this type of division generates social mobilization that reach critical points with the Shopperville crisis mentioned above. Now, in these slides, we can see some example of forms of segregations, as, for example, public transportations. Some of them are for black people, and some of them were to white people. Also, public and common areas were stricter for the black population, as some touristic areas as beach. And we can see another slide.
Okay, below we will mention the main segregation laws. And the first one is the Mixed Marriages Act of 1949, which private marriage between whites and members of the other groups. This law punished both those who contract marriages and the officials who perform them. The second one is the Population Registration Act of 1950, and which established the parameters for establishing races and obligate all persons over 16 years old, 16 years old of age to carry a racial identity card. And another segregation law is the Morality Act of 90, 1950, which prohibited sexual relations between persons of different racial groups. And another segregation law is Group Areas Act, enacted in 1970s. It established the obligation to live in separate residential areas. In order to enforce this law, thousands of people were recollected and forced to leave their homes and recently in place designated for the racial group. And another one is the Bantu Education Law in 1953, and finally in 1956 the Industrial Conciliation Act. So in this slide we will see the domestic and international solutions that were carried out. The first of these is the official emblem of the International Year Against Apartheid by the United Nations in 1977. And then in 1979, Vora came to power and realized that in the face of the struggle of the South African people and international pressure, apartheid will be difficult to sustain. In this sense, the changes depended in 1990 with the arrival to the presidency of Willem de Klerk, who repealed the segregationist laws and freed Nelson Mandela. In 1994, multiracial elections were were held to the first time, which brought Mandela to the presidency and made him the first black president of South Africa.
Okay, so now it is important to consider that some domestic solution in this sense are in 1996, the national constitution is approved, and also a certain kind of accountability with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission are established in order to investigate some segregation crimes. And the next year, in 1997, the national constitution into force. So this also imply a new episode of the of South Africa. So we, for this last part, we need to consider one of the most important questions that some post-colonial critics author mentioned. Was the apartheid really abolished in its entirety? So it is interesting in some cases, but finally, as a criticism of the various authors who mentioned that apartheid has ended, in its entirety, we can see that the Dr. Mandani chapters mention how the creation of nation-states in Africa is influenced not only by colonization, which has been transformed into coloniality, but also, at least in the case of South Africa, apartheid strongly influenced the application of modern values for the consolidation of democracy to a certain extent. It is extremely important that one of the strongest points that the country achieved was the reconciliation with the vulnerable people and groups, establishes certain mechanism of accountability, at least in theory. However, the search for justice is extremely lax, as it oscillates between social or economic or political justice. Another strong problem is that despite the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions and the disrationalization of law, groups such as civil society, civil and political rights, and finally the state still maintain the traditional structure of pre-apartheid South Africa. So we join and quote the author question: would it be an exaggeration to say that the post-apartheid transition has given us a non-rational apartheid? This question also implies that it is important to consider some other things, but this is a point to open the debate if really apartheid has finally ended. But as a final note, we feel that it is important to see the effect that this process has left. So it is so in this last part, the critique of we need to see the critique of apartheid, of course. And also, we don't seek to speak for the vulnerable people, but rather we seek to understand and comprehend whether the effects are really over for the practical purpose of this presentation. But in reality, we see that these effects and impacts are not over yet. So this is the so this critique, this thought, this opinion of this author for the chapter of perspective on political violence in states formation in post-colonial Africa, it is important to understand that not all the ideas of apartheid are really end. So this is the critics for this process and also the end of this presentation. Thank you, and this is our bibliography.